Mark, and thanks, Victor, for running the magic behind the curtain. And good morning to everyone. I'm beaming at you from the Ventura River watershed up in Ventura County, north of LA, which is our home base. I think how we're going to do this is it's just easier for me to run through the content, and then I'll stop the screen share and get a chance to see some of your faces. Right at the moment, I'm operating two screens, so we'll save the Q&A for the end. Appreciate the opportunity to be back with you all at St. John's. Some of you will recall that I was with you in September 2018, so about almost 2 years ago, at which point I spoke about watershed discipleship. This time, Mark wanted me to continue with the notion of creation, theology of creation, but in a broader time and relating it to the pandemic, which I'll try to do this morning. I've changed the theme a little bit from what I told Mark earlier, since we talked a lot about water in September 2018. I want to try to address the broader question a little bit here. So here's what I want to do. When it comes to a biblical theology of creation, we need to be clear that the ancient writers were reflecting on creation from amidst a social and political crisis. Their stories were not forged in privileged insulation from violence and oppression, as is so much white creation spirituality these days. Rather, the biblical writers composed from exile after the destruction of their nation. So we can't speak about creation biblically without also speaking about social crises, which is certainly appropriate to the moment that we are in. So this is what I'd like to try to cover this morning. It'll be a broad brush covering a lot of ground. So I'm hoping that some of you might be able to come back to the recording afterwards if you missed some of it. Those of you who recall our conversation about watershed discipleship will remember that phrase is a triple entendre. The first meaning recognizes that we are in a watershed historical moment of crisis, which demands that environmental and social justice and sustainability be integral to everything we do as Christians and as citizen inhabitants of specific places. Obviously, this crisis is closer to the surface recently, with the widespread protests across the US and beyond after the police murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis last month, almost exactly a month ago now. It's not, unfortunately, the first time that we've seen Los Angeles burn because of rage against police brutality. Perhaps some of you remember 1992, or perhaps even 1965. I was in LA in both cases. The truth is, past and present issues of justice for Black lives continue to haunt our body politic. The ongoing legacy of American apartheid that manifests in current disparities in healthcare and economic opportunity, which have been so dramatically revealed by the COVID pandemic. That's why Pastor Raphael Warnock of Atlanta's famous Ebenezer Baptist Church, the pulpit where Martin Luther King Jr. served back in the day, recently called the pandemic a double virus, the virus of COVID-19 and 1619. Obviously referring to the disease of racism that landed on the shores of America with the first slave ship 401 years ago. The second meaning of watershed discipleship also acknowledges the bioregional locus of an incarnational following of Jesus. That is to say, our discipleship and the life of the local church inescapably takes place in a watershed local context, which means that our politics are always local. And I presume that at St. John's, you've all been reflecting on how you are working for Black lives to matter right there in Los Angeles. The fact is, working for creation and working for racial and economic justice are not different things. I really like how Adrienne Marie Brown puts it here. And the wake-up call, things are not getting worse, they're getting uncovered. The wake-up call has been ringing since 1619. Actually, I'll argue this morning it's been ringing since the 6th century before the Common Era. So as Brown puts it, let's hold each other tight and take this morning a deep dive into uncovering the roots of our crisis, because that is what a biblical theology of creation does. Let's begin at the beginning. Origin stories matter. Our relationships with one another, with God, and with the earth are deeply shaped by such stories. Now, for most of human history on the planet, the various myths about the beginning shared a great deal in common. They told diverse stories, but they all had to do with how God or the gods placed human beings in a created world for vocational purposes. For millennia, these origin stories stressed a relationship between humans and the earth that was purposeful and respectful, from indigenous tales of emergence to high religious drama. But those stories began to change with the rise of first imperial city-states around the 5th millennium before the Common Era. Then the stories began to narrate conflicts and greed and punishment and conspiracies by gods on high to ensure that human beings would be their slaves. You see, origin stories matter, and they always reflect social systems. Our Genesis story was composed from several earlier sources during Israel's captivity in Babylon, and it explicitly contradicts the Babylonian Atrahasis saga, which was both a creation and a flood story. Genesis has functioned, obviously, to shape culture and identity throughout Christendom for the last 1,500 years, for good and for ill, but it has been taken out of its original context, as we'll see in a moment. But let's face it, the Genesis story is not our operative origin story in our culture anymore, not by a long shot. With the rise of Western modernity, powerful Enlightenment ideologies of capitalism and rationalism first challenged and then deconstructed and eventually eclipsed the biblical traditions, replacing them with the heroic myth of progress. Bronowski's famous trope, the Ascent of Man, is our official civilizational story today. It's mediated in myriad ways through discourses of science and popular culture. In this origin story, in the beginning was a natural world that was hostile and dangerous and defined by scarcity. Human beings who lived within that natural world were primitive and unproductive and frankly uninteresting. The task of human ingenuity was to ascend, to conquer nature so it would serve our needs alone. Our job was to re-engineer the world to conform to our desires. The story of progress is a tale with a narcissistic plot in which is fundamentalist. The human journey dawned in a wilderness world characterized only by a struggle for survival. But modern humans emerged from the swamp of ignorant Neanderthal to the triumph of increasingly rational, technologically adept, and socially complex Homo sapiens. And the story really only matters to us once these human beings start building cities. History begins with civilization, and civilization begins with empires. That is a narrative, friends, and it rules our minds still. Now, ancient Rome had its own triumphal version of imperial civilization as the new paradise, and so did medieval England. But the ideology of progress really picked up steam, no pun intended, in our modern era, when European philosophical project began in the 17th century by thinkers like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, which sought to unravel the last strands of human interdependence with nature. Creation was turned into an object. It was instrumentalized and, most importantly, despiritualized. These ideas paved the way for the elites of Europe to privatize formerly Commonwealth lands, to accumulate wealth through more efficient resource exploitation, and to radically reshape both culture and nature through social and industrial engineering. By marginalizing a creator and exalting an autonomous humanity, the Enlightenment produced a compelling historical fable about the nobility of civilization and its redemption of a deeply flawed natural world. The story began to be fused then in the 18th and 19th centuries with European exceptionalism, white supremacy, expansionism, and manifest destiny, particularly during the age of global colonization. All of this is best articulated in the American context in a famous image that is truly worth 1,000 words. I'm sure you've seen John Gast's American Progress, painted in 1872, just a few years after the driving of the Golden Spike and the Transcontinental Railroad. Here, the American story of conquest from sea to shining sea is articulated. The sun is shining in the east. Indigenous people and wild animals are fleeing west into darkness. This is clearly a creation story. Note the ubiquitous signs of civilization, with the militia leading the charge in the foreground, followed immediately by mining interests and agriculture, transportation moving relentlessly westward. And notice that the figure in the middle is stringing telegraph wire. Now, this is a complete secularization of the Manifest Destiny story. There's no biblical imagery here. She's not holding a Bible. She's holding a school book, and she is not Jesus. She is Columbia, right? The female archetypal representation of the spirit of Columbus. This is the story of progress, and it's profoundly consequential. Now, in the 20th century, with the North American continent having been conquered, colonized, and controlled by capitalism, the scientific story of progress has gotten into skirmishes with older religious ideas of creation. But don't be fooled by these still roiling debates between evolution and creationism. That dispute is frankly a trivialization of the real issue on both sides. The conservative movement keeps blaming Darwinism for our religious ills, but ironically, those same conservatives have thoroughly embraced the bastard child of Darwinism, namely social Darwinism. It was Herbert Spencer who, at the end of the 19th century, not Darwin, coined the phrase survival of the fittest. You see, social Darwinism offered a perfect moral justification for America's Gilded Age, when robber barons controlled much of American industry. The gap between rich and poor turned into a chasm. Urban slums festered, and the wealthy bought off politicians. This milieu allowed somebody like John D. Rockefeller, for example, to claim that the fortune he had accumulated through the giant Standard Oil Trust was, quote, merely a survival of the fittest, the working out of a law of nature and of God. So you see the persistence of the old imperial origin story. The many must serve the few on high. Well, as we moved into the 21st century, the multiple crises of our time, social, political, and ecological, have caused widespread disillusionment with this modernist origin story. And if in the 19th century the grand myths were communicated in paintings, for us this disillusionment is reflected in modern, particularly apocalyptic and dystopian films. So the messianic fable of progress has fallen on rather hard times. Postmodernist and post-colonial streams of thought have, over the last 30 years, steadily undermined the foundation of progressivist faith. The old orthodoxies are being deconstructed and even ridiculed, as you can see from these parodies of the Ascent of Man. Cynicism increasingly rules our discourse, masking our despair. Yeah, the party of progress is over, but the ecological and social and economic bills are now coming due. This, by the way, is my favorite parody regarding progress as a gendered narrative. So our present crises open up a new window through which to reconsider the Genesis story as an alternative myth of beginnings. But let us be clear, in the Bible, there is no creation story without also a fall story that has to do with creation re-engineered. Because the creation myth of Genesis is a protest story. It's a polemic against ancient Babylonians and all imperial structures that exploit creation and people. So let's take another look at Genesis, which, as it turns out, is not one but three creation stories that tell a longer tale. The primeval history of Genesis is an origin story that contradicts every key aspect of the salvation story of progress, which is why it's been widely ridiculed in post-Enlightenment modernity as mythological or pre-scientific or, frankly, silly. Let me offer an overview reading of Genesis 1 to 11 that has profound implications for ecology, for theology, and for politics in our moment of interlocking social and environmental crises. The first story in Genesis 1 stresses repeatedly that each aspect of the biosphere is created and pronounced by the Creator good. The adjective is tov, and it expresses God's intense pleasure at every detail. This is God's cosmic wow. A divine assessment appears, as you can see, in emphatic, ecstatic refrain, some 8 times in Genesis 1. And this is all before humans arrive on the scene. In other words, this is a world that is beneficent and bountiful and in no need of human genius to improve or to control it. Meanwhile, the Hebrew verb bara, reserved exclusively in the Bible for God's creative activity, can also mean to be fat. The earth embodies a rich, lavish overflow of goodness, abundance, and life-giving at its very core. The first creation story, in other words, contrasts sharply with 2 key Enlightenment notions. There is no natural scarcity, and the presumption that the earth has no intrinsic value until humans re-engineer it into something useful is nowhere to be found. This brings us to the second Genesis creation account, in which we're told that the human being, in Hebrew Adam, is formed from the topsoil, in Hebrew Adamah, a wordplay that is tellingly preserved in the English human humus. Scripture is unembarrassed and straightforward. We are birthed from the earth, but so is all flora and fauna. This spiritual and material understanding of earth as mother has long been embraced both by old indigenous cultures and increasingly by the new biological sciences, but it's been ignored within Christendom for far too long. In Genesis 2, human beings are portrayed as deeply embedded within this living biosphere with a divine appointment as caretaker in intimate relationship with all of creation. Whatever Adam called each living being, that was its name, we're told. This same relational intimacy is signaled in another Hebrew word of woman, isha, from the body of man, ish, a relationship of solidarity, not hierarchy. Genesis offers a picture of symbiosis between humans, nature, and the spirit world. Remember, God walks among the garden. There is no signs of civilization, no built environment, no technology, no alienation, and no forced labor. But there is a crucial caveat. All of this abundance is contingent upon human beings remaining obedient to their vocation to serve and preserve creation. To neglect stewardship and to take too much of the divine gift is to reckon with disaster. which, as you know, is exactly what happens now in this story, and indeed what happened in the history of civilization. This primal symbiosis is shattered in Genesis primeval narrative's third story, a tragic tale that begins but does not end in Genesis 3. The equilibrium of Eden suffers an epical rupture known in Christian tradition as the fall. Adam and the mother of all life, Hava, conspire to defy the divine taboo against grasping the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Though long read in our churches as a theological morality play, especially about sex, this tale is much deeper than that. I believe it's a mythological way of explaining the change in consciousness that propelled the rise of civilization. That is, the forbidden fruit symbolizes the human conceit that we, by employing our ingenuity, our technology, and our social organization, can improve on creation. It may be good, but it's not good enough for us. From this view, the creation and fall story represents an ancient warning tale produced by Israel's sages in the aftermath of a failed Israelite experiment in civilization. They were attempting to understand their historic experience of royal exploitation, of civil war, and eventually of conquest and dispossession in the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries before the Common Era. But not only their own, they were also reflecting on the etiology, the origins of human oppression and violence that had brought both Israel and all other tribal peoples to the brink of extinction. The Genesis story identifies the problem not just as moral, but anthropological. Something had gone fundamentally wrong with the human journey, of which Israel's national trauma was only a symptom. Think of Genesis 1 to 11 then as a sort of searching post 9/11 type reflection, except that the Hebrew scribes of old had the courage to look at the contradiction of their own civilizational experiment rather than avoiding self-examination by scapegoating their enemies. It's instructive that the consequences of the fall, according to Genesis 3, the second half of Genesis 3, are the woman's pain in childbirth and the man's condemnation to aggregate cultural toil. In other words, both undergo forced labor under a farming regime. The woman must bear more and more children, while Adam must struggle with the Hadamah that is no longer a gift, but increasingly a curse. There's both political and historical memory operating here about how the original abundance of free hunter-gatherer horticulturists had been lost. Societies that now domesticated animals and subdued the land for maximized production ultimately subdue and domesticate human beings into serfdom. The fall story thus reflects the curse of aggressive colonizing civilizations. Agriculture portends the end of Eden. This is further underlined by the dramatic scene in Genesis, the archetypal story of Cain and Abel. God's warning to the farmer Cain, whose name means spear, is telling. Sin is lurking at your door. Its desire is for you. You must master it, says God to Cain. This is the first use of the word sin in Torah. It implies that there is now a power loose in the world that is predatory and addictive, which humans must recognize and resist. Abel, on the other hand, symbolizes the remnant of the older, not yet fully domesticated lifeways. He's a pastoralist, a nomadic forager. He lives with animals outside the village. He seems to enjoy God's favor. The very first murder in this story takes place in a field, the farmer's domain. In Genesis 4:10, it articulates further human alienation from the earth. The blood, dam, of your brother cries out from the ground, Adama. For a second time, God pronounces that the natural fertility of the creation has been and will be compromised by the farmer's presumption over life. And again, the consequence is exile for a second time, intensified now. Cain becomes a wanderer and a fugitive in the earth. Genesis 4:14. As Wendell Berry often points out, industrial agriculture, in contrast to local horticulture, has no sense of home, wanders the world eager to exploit its advantage, displacing and destroying people of place. The traumatized Cain's survival strategy is to build the first city, which, as Jacques Ellul long pointed out, deepens the trajectory of the fall. Cain names the first city after his son Enoch, whose name means recreation, re-engineering, chanach. The vocation of the city indeed seeks a new beginning, to re-engineer all of life according to the dictates of anthropocentric civilization. And within 4 generations, we're told that the progeny of Cain's project, Lamech, vows the politics of massive retaliation to every opponent. Lamech is the prototypical great man, a literal translation of the Sumerian word for king, Lugal. His boast has been repeated by emperors throughout history. The same spirit moved the king of Babylon to strike his people with unceasing blows and rule the nations in anger with unrelenting persecution, as Isaiah put it in Isaiah 14:6. Indeed, we're told the earth is filled with violence, Genesis 6:11. This is attributed to the rise of the Nephilim, an untranslatable Hebrew moniker sometimes rendered as giants in the earth. These beings are clearly identified as mighty warriors in Genesis 6:4. It's a strange term that appears again in the report of Israelite spies dispatched by Moses to do reconnaissance on the fortified cities of Canaan in Numbers 13. The people that we saw in it are of great size, they say. There we saw the Nephilim, and we seemed like grasshoppers to them. The Nephilim of Genesis 6 seem to symbolize the warrior classes that had come to dominate the ancient Near East with the rise of the great city-states. So begins the longest war in history, in which relentlessly expanding civilizations conquer and exploit the earth and all who try to live symbiotically with her. It's a war that continues to our day. Domestication gives rise to agricultural states, gives rise to violent expansion, gives rise to empire. No wonder that only 6 chapters into the Genesis story, the Creator is having second thoughts about having made the world. Of course, there's a great divine countermeasure that takes place at this point in the story, that being, of course, God's commission to Noah to preserve life from a flood meant to halt this spiral of violence. Note that only living things are taken aboard this ark, both plants and animals. No artifacts of civilization. Noah's project results in a renewed covenant with all living things, the famous rainbow sign. Again, a covenant that's made not exclusively with humans, and certainly not with human civilization, but with all living beings. The heart of this new covenant is to reestablish respect for life, all of life. Nevertheless, on the heels of this new covenant comes a sinister genealogy of empire in Genesis 10. We might call this a resurgence of the virus. These new city-states seem to give birth to one another, and they seem to spring from the seed of the Nephilim. After all, we're told that their greatest offspring is the mythical Nimrod, the great hunter, a reference to the powerful Mesopotamian city-state of Nimrud. Empires are, in other words, innately predatory. As one scholar concludes, in a very real sense, true warfare may be viewed as the most important social consequence of the agricultural revolution. So history, as we think of it, commences with the rise of the first civilization around the 5th millennium before the Common Era, recognizable to us by their concentrated populations, their official religious cults, their city-state organizations, their standing armies, their hierarchical politics, their surplus economies, and their profound separation from nature. All peoples who lived prior to or outside this paradigm are dismissed as prehistoric. It is the civilized who have forged order out of nature's chaos, and the earth and its resources exist to satiate the needs and desires of the elites who run this project. It happened first in Mesopotamia and then in Egypt, where delta waterways were harnessed for irrigated farming. And the Semitic tribes of Palestine, of whom the Hebrews were one, had front row seats to this unfolding drama, and they were among its first victims, which suggests that the old traditions that lie behind the Genesis narrative were perhaps the world's first literature of resistance to civilization. As you know, the account concludes with the archetypal summary tale that takes place on the plain of Shinar, aka Babylon, in Genesis 10 and 11, symbolizing the Fertile Crescent. The tower symbolizes the fortress architecture of domination, the hierarchical management of imperial conformity, and the centrifugal power of empire to pull everything into itself. Its heights represent the depths of the biblical fall, the triumph of the wayward human impulse to re-engineer the world in order to control and improve it. The towers, citadels of fortress cities, appear frequently in Scripture as the target of prophetic denunciation, as you can see here in Isaiah 2, or again in Ezekiel 31. This primal struggle against empire would inform Israel's prophetic tradition, in which every kingdom is compared to Babel and is promised the same fate. The Genesis story of creation and fall contradicts the modern fantasy of progress at every important point. Civilization is not ascent, but descent into madness. Human beings were not destined for the city, but took a fateful wrong turn, which has now become an endgame. The lesson of all this is that we must repent, which is to say, to turn around from this disastrous historic direction. Specifically, Genesis 11 is a thinly veiled parody of Mesopotamian ziggurats. Babel is another Hebrew wordplay. Balal means to confuse, while in Akkadian, Babelu means the gate of the gods, an allusion to the top of the ziggurat where the emperor communed with his imperial gods. In other words, the Hebrews believed that the imperial peoples were deeply, deeply confused. Now, these towers claim to reach the heavens, but Genesis 11 is a satire because God must come down to investigate them. In the face of Babel's aspiration to omnipotence, the divine council recommends deconstruction of imperial monoculture in favor of the original vision of a dispersed, tribally diverse humanity. Imperial centripetality is deconstructed by divine centrifugality, a fleeing to the margins. The divinely endorsed counter-strategy is that humans reconceive of themselves living in small, scattered groups on the land. And this counter-narrative begins with a new start on the heels of the ancient Babel warning tale. Abram is called by Yahweh. There we go. Abram is called by Yahweh out of Mesopotamia and journeys to the marginal desert lands of Palestine. He is the first believer to go feral from civilization in order to serve Creator. This is the first chapter of the counter story of liberation in the Bible, which will continue through the Exodus story and through the prophets and on into the New Testament. To underline this movement, it is a return to the old ways of symbiosis with nature. Abram's first encounter with God occurs under an oak tree in Genesis 12. The Hebrew Elon More means teacher or oracle giver. That is, Abram begins anew under this tree of life, this axis mundi, this teaching tree. Here he pitches his nomad's tents. Here God first tells Abram about his future on the land. And it is here that Abram builds the first altar in the Bible. So does Abram's oak tree mediate the first divine instruction on how to recreate human identity outside of civilization and its discontents. Similar instructions will later come to Moses on a mountaintop, and the people will take refuge in the wilderness. And the prophets will renew this vision in the wilderness, and Jesus will renew this vision in the wilderness. Well, that's quite a story, quite a saga. And what I'd like to do is conclude with two brief exercises with you, a way of living into the third iteration of watershed discipleship, which means to become a disciple of our bioregion, to learn it enough to know it, and enough to love it, enough to save it. Now, up here in Ventura County, we've observed that for the past 10 years, we celebrate the solstice in a Christian liturgical tradition. And I want to gain a little bit of that spirit of Abram under the teaching tree as the seed of liberation in our counter origin story of Genesis. And I want to invite us to recognize today as the summer solstice. You see, the solstice is a simple way of paying attention to our place and to our planet. Now, you all know that Indigenous people understood this from the beginning. You perhaps know about the famous sun dagger in petroglyphs in Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, for example, right? This is how Indigenous people told time and observed the seasons by watching the sun's movement around the landscape. Well, here from our own region is an arbor glyph made by the Indigenous people of my area, the Chumash. It's called the scorpion tree. It used to be thought of as a cowboy carving in the Santa Lucia Mountains of San Luis Obispo County. Turns out that this 6-foot tall tree resembles other Chumash rock paintings in other parts of the Central Coast, some of which were known to keep track of important time and dates. So through careful research, we've learned that this arbor glyph actually was a calendar of important events. The bottom part of the image looks like a lizard. It's a representation of the movement of a shadow over the course of the year. And it was essentially a sundial for the Chumash. With this instrument, a stick is aligned with the North Star, and the lines drawn on the rock that look like a scorpion actually trace the movement of the stars on the days of the summer solstice, which is today, as well as the fall equinox, the winter solstice, and the spring equinox, each important cultural days of the Chumash. So what we have here is a reminder that Indigenous people paid attention to creation. If you go to this URL, by the way, there's a very cool animated film that explains how this arbor glyph sundial actually worked. So I want to just invite you today to a simple discipline of observation, whether you're in the city or in the country. I want you tonight at sunset, hopefully it won't be overcast, to just mark somewhere in a sit spot where the sun went down. And then when the fall equinox rolls around, go to that same sit spot and mark where the sun goes down. And then again at the winter solstice, and then again at the spring equinox. It's just a way of paying attention to place, of becoming a disciple of our place. And did you know, for our second discipline, that today is National Indigenous Peoples Day in Canada? Matter of fact, later today I'm going to be doing another online liturgy with some Cree friends, some Cree elders from Saskatchewan, as part of our own Episcopal inspired farm church up here. So the second discipline on this solstice is to pay attention to the Indigenous people of your place, the Tongva people. Get to know them, because in the middle of this social crisis we're in, it's important to remember that Native lives matter. This is a social crisis, a crisis between indigeneity and civilization that has been playing out on this continent for 530 years. Well, let me stop there. And we've got about 15 minutes to open it up for some conversation. I will stop sharing screen so I can see folk and we can have a little bit of conversation. I know this is a lot, which is why I thought you might want to go back to it. It's a big scope of history and philosophy, but let's